Thank you. Good morning, members of the media. I'm Yuen, independent senator for British Columbia. It's my pleasure to be sponsoring today's press conference, which is on C9, the so-called Combating Hate Bill. As many of you know, it is still in the House of Commons in committee, but it has generated a great deal of controversy and concern among various groups, a number of which are here today. And my colleagues will be speaking to the concerns that they see in C9. As you've heard already, we will have first the Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council, followed by the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, Independent Jewish Voices Canada, Legal Support Committee, the Public Service Alliance of Canada, and last but not least, the United Church of Canada. With that, let me turn to the Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council.
Thank you, Senator. Good morning and thank you for joining us. My name is Khaled Al-Qazzaz and I am the Executive Director of the Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council. Together, along with 23 faith-based civil liberties and community organizations, collectively issued a joint statement on December 1st rejecting Bill C9, the so-called Combating Hate Act. We are here as part of a coast-to-coast coalition raising the alarm about Bill C9 and the unprecedented expansion of police and state power it represents. This coalition brings together multi-faith, civil society, legal defense, and labor communities, each sounding the alarm from a different vantage point, but united in the belief that Bill C9 threatens core democratic freedoms and should be withdrawn. Across Canada, we're witnessing a troubling shift in which peaceful protest, cultural expression, and political advocacy are increasingly framed as threats to public order. Bill C9 is part of this wider trend. By introducing vague offenses, expanding police discretion, and creating new tools that can easily be misused, the bill accelerates the erosion of civic space and the rights that underpin a healthy democracy. These risks are not theoretical. Black, Indigenous, Muslim, Arab, and other racialized and faith-based communities who are already disproportionately surveilled and policed stand to be the most deeply affected. If adopted, Bill C9 would contribute to a growing legal architecture that chills dissent, restricts protest, and undermines freedom of expression in Canada. Furthermore, we as faith communities reject entirely the proposed amendments being discussed, attempting to remove the good faith exemption of religious text in the criminal code. These amendments intensify rather than mitigate the bill's most harmful elements, further expanding criminalization. Such amendments must be understood in the broader context of how expanded criminalization can be leveraged beyond their stated intent. Once this precedent is set, government could build on this, trade away Canadian rights to suit many types of foreign or commercial interest. The stakes are clear. Bill C9 is not a hate crime bill or an anti-hate crime bill. It is Canada's most significant attempt in a generation to restrict protest and silence dissent. Bill C9 does not protect the public from harm. It protects institutions from accountability, expands punitive policing, and criminalizes the democratic expression of communities across Canada. Together, this panel demonstrates the breadth and cohesion of national opposition to the bill and reinforces the collective call for Parliament to withdraw this bill. And I pass it on to Tim McSorley from ICLMG.
Thank you very much, Khaled, and thank you very much, Senator Wu, for hosting us today. I'm proud to be here on behalf of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, a coalition of Canadian organizations from a broad range of sectors that works to defend civil liberties in Canada against negative impacts from Canada's national security and anti-terrorism laws. Our coalition has observed with distress the increase in hate-based violence across Canada over the past several years, including Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and hate targeted at the 2SL LGBTQI+ community. Like our colleagues here today and the Canadian public at large, we believe greater measures must be taken to address the instances of hate-based violence. But such measures must be targeted and specific and ensure that they do not unduly impact civil liberties or charter rights, including of those who the measures are ostensibly meant to protect. Unfortunately, several measures in Bill C9 fail that test. Along with other organizations here, through legislative briefs, open letters, and appearances at committee, we have shared these substantial concerns with MPs and the government. Ultimately, The breadth of these problems in Bill C-9 have led us to conclude that the bill must be withdrawn and rethought. What's in the legislation? To begin, it would repeal the requirement that the Attorney General consent to the institution of proceedings of hate propaganda offenses, which have been a crucial oversight mechanism given the sensitivity and impact of hate crime charges. Next, it would create four new criminal code offenses. First, a new offense of willfully promoting hatred against any identifiable group by displaying certain symbols in a public place, punishable by up to 2 years in prison. Second, it would create a hate crime offense of committing an offense under any other act or any other act of Parliament that is motivated by hatred based on certain factors, with sentences commensurate with the underlying offense. Third, it would create an offense of intimidating a person with the intent of causing fear in order to impede them from accessing certain places that are primarily used for religious worship or by an identifiable group for certain purposes. And fourth, it would create another offense of intentionally obstructing or interfering with a person's lawful access to such places. Finally, the bill would also integrate for the first time a definition of hate into the criminal code based largely on Supreme Court jurisprudence. While the components of Bill C-9 may appear to be measured and proportionate in order to address hate crimes in Canada, a closer examination of the details of the bill raised significant concerns around threats to free expression, freedom of assembly, and the ability for the public to engage in protest and dissent. In short, it would threaten a swath of charter-protected rights of Canadians and people in Canada. For example, we are deeply concerned with provisions of the bill that will link the criminalization of the willful promotion of hatred by the public display of certain symbols to Canada's terrorist entities list. The public is rightly concerned when individuals call for hate-based violence against any community or person, whether through the use of certain symbols or not. However, these new provisions would go much further by granting police broad discretionary powers to arrest individuals based on the police officer's interpretation of the symbols or signs individuals display at protests. Over the past several months, we have seen heated arguments and accusations that certain symbols associated with protests in support of Palestinian human rights are either hateful, are associated with a terrorist entity, or both. Peaceful and lawful protests have been unjustly accused of fomenting hate based on the signs and slogans that they carry or chant. Under this new legislation, police can make a determination in the middle of a march or protest, not just of what constitutes a symbol associated with one of Canada's 86 listed terrorist entities. Not just of what constitutes a symbol, but also whether or not it's used or associated with them. The concept of a symbol that is used or associated with is very open-ended, given that terrorist entities may use, adopt, or co-opt, or even simply use images of slogans that the members of the public may also be using. This could include not just the outright display of a flag of a terrorist group, for example, but also an individual wearing a keffiyeh or displaying a disputed symbol or sign at a protest. This is made more complicated by the fact that police would also be empowered to make the decision that a symbol so nearly resembles the symbol associated with a terrorist entity. For example, would Arabic writing on a sign that a police officer believes is similar enough to writing found on imagery used by a listed terrorist entity be enough to arrest an individual and ask questions later? Or would a banner or even clothing of a certain color, if used by a terrorist organization, be viewed as violating the law? And this confusion would of course apply to all 86 listed entities and could impact protests from a broad range of communities across the political spectrum. These issues raise current questions of guilt by association or the tarring of entire movements with suspicion. We have seen this throughout the last 20 years of anti-terrorism measures. Finally, we are troubled by the fact that the symbols in question are based on the terrorist entities list, which itself brings a whole host of problems. Serious issues with Canada's terrorist entities procedures include the imposition of serious financial and possible criminal consequences on the basis of unaccountable, secretive executive listing decisions, the use of secret evidence, and the absence of adequate avenues for challenging listings and obtaining redress. Decisions to list or not can also be political and discretionary in nature. There's also the ambiguity of the language of the law. The government has said that the simple display of an image in public would not constitute a crime. However, a close reading of the law points to the fact that this could be the interpretation and that it wouldn't have to be used in any other circumstance rather than just being displayed in public. This needs to be clarified immediately and changed in the legislation and is one of the reasons why we believe that ultimately it must be withdrawn. Finally, we're also concerned about what has been happening at committee over the last few days with clause-by-clause consideration. MPs from across political parties have moved to propose new offenses of so-called promotion of terrorist activities. These new provisions harken back to much maligned and protested Bill C-51 under the Harper Conservative government, that the Liberal government itself eventually overturned. At the time, it was recognized by legal experts and human rights advocates and MPs themselves that an offense of advocating terrorism offenses would not survive a charter challenge because of its undue limits on free expression. This new offense goes further, and we believe that is going in the wrong direction, and that MPs must reconsider their approach, and that ultimately they need to withdraw the bill and reconsider how they're addressing hate crimes in Canada. Thank you.
Rachelle? You're next, please.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Rachelle Friesen. I'm so grateful to be here with you today. I'm with the Legal Support Committee here in Toronto. We're a community of organizers dedicated to supporting people who have been criminalized for their support of Palestine in Toronto for the last 2 years. Bill C-9 proposes greenlighting police overreach, further enabling them to criminalize dissent. We do not need to hypothesize what it would look like on the ground when police are granted broad discretion in charging, surveilling, and criminalizing dissent. We have been seeing this play out in Toronto for the last 2 years. To know the harms of Bill C-9 will bring, we need to understand the current experiences on the ground. With Toronto Police as a case study, I will outline the current reality. Even without C-9 in place, we can have an understanding of what will happen. And while this may seem oddly specific, Policing Palestine falls under Project Resolute, which is a nationwide affair of municipal, provincial, and federal police forces working, strategizing, and learning from each other. As the Legal Support Committee, we have supported over the 160 people arrested for protesting Canadian complicity in the genocide of Palestinians. And we have seen a few things. One is the systemic racism in Canadian institutions by having every Palestine-related arrest fall under the hate crimes unit of the Toronto Police, regardless of the circumstances of the arrest, therefore labeling every act opposing a genocide as inherently hateful. We have seen Toronto Police impose bail conditions banning people from taking part in protests, which openly violate their Section 2 Charter protected rights. And we have also seen the use of TPS press releases to inflict maximum amount of damage on an arrested person's life. What we have seen is a pattern of overcharging, brutalizing, and surveilling of Palestine solidarity activists. Dozens of people have been sent to the hospital as a result of police violence, including 50 people who Toronto Police have given concussions to, many dealing with symptoms from their injuries months and years later. Toronto Police have conducted over 15 home raids of Palestine supporters, while people have reported being stalked by Toronto Police as they go about their daily life. Following a person being charged, police have often released factually inaccurate media advisories about what has happened. The media has then regurgitated these releases with an adamant refusal to include statements from grassroots organizations. These press releases have spurred doxing campaigns against arrestees, and this backlash can be so severe that people have lost their employment and even their housing. In Toronto, since October 2023, there have been 166 arrests of Palestine supporters. 84 people have had their charges resolved, and 84% of those have received full withdrawals, with only one arrestee actually being convicted and the rest receiving complete or absolute discharges. Now, overcharging is strategic. Overcharging is intended to put people through a lengthy process that arbitrarily targets activists, dehumanizes them, damages their lives, and puts them under undue stress for months at a time, even over a year. The process is the punishment. In addition, overcharging and arresting people opens up avenues for increased state surveillance, even when the charges do not stand up in court. Bill C-9 will just further exacerbate this. The Toronto Police Service have also put bail conditions like protest bans on arrestees, which are a direct violation of their charter rights. Even though these bans rarely hold up in court, TPS continues to apply them. It is alarming that Bill C-9 is giving police so much power when in Toronto, we have seen time and time again the Toronto police violate our charter rights with impunity. Within the already existing laws, the Toronto police have been able to hold vast discretionary powers, violating people's right to protest. Even prior to the bubble zone bylaw legislation, TPS has blocked protesters from marching in the street. They have demanded that a demonstration of thousands of people only remain in intersections for 5 minutes at a time. And if they extend that time, they threaten violence and arrests. It is absurd to give police additional discretionary powers with blind trust that they will respect the charter when even without Bill C-9, they have had no interest in upholding the charter as they flagrantly and repeatedly violate it. Bill C-9 is hiding behind the name Combating Hate Act and greenlighting even more discretionary power being given to the police. Knowing that policing disproportionately impacts Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities, Bill C-9 will not only violate our existing rights, it will create two-tiered policing of protests where protests are enabled or forbidden based on people's racial or political identity. We need to ask ourselves, do we want a system to be put into effect where people only have the right to protest if it's in line with Canada's foreign policy? At its core, Bill C-9 does not combat hate. Rather, it is a ruse for the state to further surveil and target protesters and strip away our charter rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachelle. I'll just note that we're usually at our allotted speaker time. You feel free to finish your remarks, but if you wouldn't mind going through a little faster, that'd be very helpful.
I'll do my best, thanks. Morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'être là. Je m'appelle Alex Silas. Je suis le vice-président national de l'Alliance de la fonction publique du Canada. So I'm here to share my perspective as a labor leader, and I'm here as a labor leader because Bill C-9 and so-called bubble zone bylaws and law projects like it are not about safety. They're about taking away fundamental democratic rights, the right to protest. As a labor movement, we know exactly what happens when governments start drawing circles on the sidewalk to decide who is allowed to speak and who isn't. Once you let them start drawing those lines, they keep drawing more. And I want to speak from experience. I've received tickets for using a megaphone. I've received tickets for grilling hot dogs on a picket line. I've been arrested and handcuffed, put in the back of a cop car, charged and held in jail for protesting and picketing, for standing shoulder to shoulder with workers demanding justice. Not because there was any violence, not because there was any threats or intimidation, but because the employer and the government did not want to see us, didn't want to hear us, the workers. Charges, I should add, that were eventually fully withdrawn by the Crown. But that experience changed me, and it taught me exactly who these laws are written to protect and who they're written to silence. Unions in this country fought tooth and nail for the right to strike and the right to protest. Those rights weren't handed to workers out of generosity. Workers marched, organized, pushed back, got arrested, and in our history were beaten and brutalized on picket lines so that we could have the freedoms Canadians may take for granted today. Bill C-9 is an attack on that legacy. It's an attack on every worker, past and present, who stood in the cold, on the picket line, fighting for respect and dignity. Et soyons clairs, ces lois frappent toujours plus fort les personnes déjà les plus marginalisées. Nous avons vu des lois instrumentalisées contre les défenseurs des terres autochtones. Nous avons vu les forces de l'ordre utilisées pour expulser des personnes sans abri. Et nous avons vu des accusations s'accumuler contre des manifestations noires et racisées. Lorsque les gouvernements commencent à restreindre la liberté de manifestation, c'est le peuple qui perd. Nous perdons nos droits et nous perdons notre pouvoir. Cependant, le projet de loi C9 ne silenciera aucunement les plus privilégiés de notre société. Bill C-9 will not silence our society's most privileged. It will not silence the ultra-wealthy. It will not silence megacorporations. But it will silence the working class, and it will silence the people who rely on protest because every other door has been closed to them. And taking to the streets is the only way they can be heard. The right to protest is not an inconvenience to democracy. It is a cornerstone of democracy. Every major advancement of rights in this country, from labor rights to civil rights to women's rights to equity rights, came because people took to the streets and refused to be ignored. If this law existed decades ago, many of the rights we enjoy today would never have been won, and if we let laws like this exist today, many of the rights we will need tomorrow may never be won. So I'm here today not only as a labor activist and union leader, but as a concerned Canadian, concerned about the perilous path that anti-protest legislation and bylaws takes us down. We cannot allow any government to criminalize dissent because it's inconvenient. Dissent is democratic. La dissidence, c'est un droit. We cannot allow those in power to control and redraw boundaries of who deserves to be heard. Workers built this country by raising our voices, not lowering them, and we're not about to stop now. Merci beaucoup, and I will now pass it over to Emily Dwyer from the United Church of Canada.
The United Church of Canada brings together more than 1,900 communities of faith from coast to coast to coast. We strive to be a bold, connected, and evolving church, one grounded in deep spirituality, inspiring worship, and a commitment to daring justice. As people of faith, the United Church believes that we all have a responsibility to work towards a Canadian society that honors diversity and opposes hate in all its forms. It is precisely because of this commitment that we cannot stay silent today. We are here to express our deep concern and opposition to Bill C-9. This bill is framed as a measure to protect people, including people in religious institutions, from acts of hatred. But our fear is that Bill C-9 will have the opposite effect. Its vague and overbroad language risks silencing and criminalizing lawful, peaceful protest in public spaces. Protest that has long been essential to democracy, to justice movements, and to holding power to account. The United Church of Canada has committed itself to anti-racism, to reconciliation and Indigenous justice, and to supporting the rights of 2S and LGBTQIA+ peoples. We take seriously the warnings of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association that, quote, instead of addressing the structural roots of racism and hatred, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, Bill C-9 perpetuates a punitive model that risks disproportionately criminalizing, yet again, the very communities it claims to protect, end quote. We are also troubled by the legislation's focus on labeling of groups as terrorists. We note Egal Canada's warning that in the current global climate, groups advocating for trans rights are being labeled as extremists. Around the world, human rights and environmental defenders are increasingly criminalized, branded terrorists, not because they threaten public safety, but because they challenge powerful interests. In places like the Philippines, my colleagues and I would most certainly be classified as terrorists simply for doing the work we do. Our long-term relationships with global partners has shown us not to take for granted how quickly democratic systems can be eroded and basic rights undermined when we let our guard down. And finally, let me be clear, religious institutions must not be shielded from public accountability. The United Church of Canada has its own history of harm. We were active participants in residential institutions. We have contributed to colonial, racist, and oppressive structures, and we have not always been a safe place for LGBTQIA+ people. We are committed to truth-telling, to repair, and to justice. But accountability is essential to that work. People must retain the right to protest, challenge, and call us and all institutions to a higher account. For all these reasons, we urge the government to withdraw Bill C-9. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Hagigi. I'm speaking on behalf of Independent Jewish Voices Canada. We're a national grassroots organization representing thousands of Jews and allies across the country, and I'm proud to speak here today against the Federal Combating Hate Act. Over the past 2 years, we've watched with growing alarm as governments at every level have increasingly invoked Jewish identity as a political tool. In moments of public pressure, suddenly every government project of expanded policing and restricted speech becomes a matter of protecting the Jewish community. This is a deeply cynical strategy. It exploits the very real fears that Jewish people have while doing absolutely nothing to address the actual anti-Semitism coming from white supremacist, far-right, and Christian nationalist movements, the very movements that have always posed the greatest threats to us in our community. During the Freedom Convoy occupation, we had a church that opened its doors to far-right organizers, housed convoy participants, and actively facilitated a movement steeped in anti-Semitism, racism, white supremacy, and hateful Christian fundamentalism. Under Bill C-9, protesters would not have been allowed to demonstrate outside this church simply because it is a religious institution. This is the absurdity and dangers of this bill. Institutions that platform far-right extremism and organizations that are complicit in war crimes would be legally protected from protest, while communities that protest genocide, violence, war, apartheid, or colonization would be criminalized. When governments adopt these distorted frameworks, they make the deliberate choice to erase the existence of Jewish people who oppose Zionism, oppose apartheid, and oppose the weaponization of our identity. So let me say this clearly as a Jewish person. Our safety will never come from criminalizing others. Our safety will never come from silencing protest. Our safety will never come from expanding police power. Our safety will come from solidarity, from dismantling the structures that target all communities, and from rejecting any law that treats political dissent as a threat to public order. Bill C-9 will not make Jewish people safer. It will make Canada less democratic, less free, and more dangerous for anyone who dissents. As a coalition, we're urging the government to take the following actions. First, withdraw Bill C-9 in its entirety. The bill's structure and intent represents an unacceptable expansion of state and policing powers. Second, retain Attorney General oversight for all hate propaganda charges. This safeguard is essential to prevent politicized or discriminatory persecutions. Third, preserve the good faith religious text defense, which is critical for protecting legitimate faith teachings and ensuring that religious communities are not chilled or criminalized. Fourth, remove vague and overbroad offenses that risk criminalizing peaceful protest, labor action, and other forms of lawful democratic expression. Fifth, reject the proposed expansion of protected zones to community, cultural, and educational buildings, which would dramatically shrink public space for dissent. And finally, ensure that terrorism listing powers are not imported into hate speech or protest-related offenses, given the well-documented lack of transparency, due process, and accountability in Canada's current listing regime. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. And with that, we'll open the floor to questions. First up is Hélène.
Oui, bonjour, Hélène Buzetti from Le Corps d'Information. I have a question regarding the religious exemption. Was it 1 year ago, Mr. Adil Sharkawi, in the Preach Allah, said that Zionists, meaning Jews, should be all exterminated. And he was not bothered by the law because of that exemption. So do you still think it's a good exemption?
I think, our organization doesn't work specifically on religious issues, but we believe that it's important that there are protections for rights under the Charter, and religious freedom is one of those rights. If an individual espouses calls for violence, then these laws do not protect that. Even the religious defense would not protect that. And so it's unclear, unless the government specifically said that they did not lay charges because of that, what the decision was behind not laying that charge. We have here today groups from various religious faiths who believe and are fearful that if this exemption was removed, that it could have a chilling effect and an impact on their communities.
Exactly what chilling effect exactly? And we're talking about hate and inciting people to commit things against targeted groups. So I'm not sure what exactly you're afraid of. Is it okay to invoke the Quran, the Bible, or whatever religious text to promote hate against a group, or even, as Mr. Sharkawi did, to promote the extermination of a group?
So I'm not familiar with the incident or the quote that you're specifically talking to, but in principle, the the religious text exemption was there for all the time to basically provide the space for religious communities to practice their faith, to understand the religious text in its entirety, and as commonly noted, religious institutions in general are ones that actually contribute to community stability, contribute to a reduction of violence. They contribute to basically this attempt to understand and interpret text in ways that makes citizens much more contributing and engaged in society. The attempt to conflate or to take things out of context or to attempt to redefine and reinterpret religious texts in ways that serve political purposes or serve criminalization intent or anything of this sort actually take things entirely out of context. So the challenge is...
Yeah, but nobody is talking about that. I mean, what the criminal code says is that you cannot incite violence and hate and all that, but if you do it with, I'm sorry, I'm thinking in French here, but with your faith. And I'm just asking you, is it really a good idea to protect hate if it's done under the guise of religious beliefs.
I think
Why do you protect that?
I don't think you're getting this accurately. So the amendments that are being proposed
I know
or being
exactly the
discussed,
amendments, yeah.
being discussed are actually attempting to remove this good faith exemption of in religious text. So it is not attempting to as you're quoting here, to protect promotion of faith. It is attempt to use to remove that exemption. So it's actually going to intervene in the interpretations and the use of this text, even within institutions, and using them within different communities. Our communities in general are against the promotion of violence, are against the promotion of hate, and they've taken additional measures actually to ensure that safety. So nobody's against this, but it has been done in ways and organized in ways that allows for religious freedom, exploration of religious text, and exploration of basically how these things are framed internally in these internal spiritual and organized religious expression.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'll be moderating the press conference. Thank you. Steph, we'll go to you next.
Thank you. And thank you to the speakers. Just sticking with the Canadian Muslim Public Affairs Council, have you had any direct conversation with any Liberal MPs specifically about supporting the removal of this religious defenses option from Section 319? And if so, like, what has been the openness for the government to maybe reconsider any support for doing so?
So it's interesting that this amendment is not yet introduced even in the close by close discussion. So it has been proposed and discussed in committee, but it's not yet a formal amendment that's been introduced. So far, all our conversation with Liberal MPs basically does not include this amendment, because it's just recently being discussed yesterday and the few days before in the public space, but not even formally as a clear. So we don't know even how is this going to be introduced, who's going to support it, and clearly this was not the intent of the original bill that was proposed.
And I guess as a follow-up, Tim, you mentioned the clause by clause talking about some addition of like a willful promotion of terrorism. I'm wondering if you can express a little bit more why that piques your interest in terms of an area of concern, that it seems that not just opposition MPs, but even like governing government MPs seem to be open to putting on the table in this bill.
Thanks for that question. So there's a few reasons why we're concerned. One is originally this was tabled as a private member's bill by a Conservative MP. And in motivating that and speaking with the media, the MP has specifically said that it is in order to address what he views as problems at protests, in order to shut down protests, and that certain words would be banned, certain activities would be banned. And we're concerned just where this bill is actually coming from, that it isn't about addressing terrorism, but rather cracking down on protest and free expression. Ultimately, though, the text that's being proposed in the private members bill, and what we believe, and this is, again, similar to the concerns around other amendments, we haven't seen the text of what the actual amendments will be yet, either from the Conservatives or from the Liberals, and we know that they have discussions around what it ultimately will be, is that we've seen in the past that very similar laws, such as the law that was adopted with Bill C-51, the advocating for terrorism offenses in general, was clearly denounced by legal experts, by MPs, as violating free expression, as violating the right to freedom of assembly and association. It's ultimately a much too broad wording. This idea of promotion goes way beyond what's already in the criminal code. We already have laws against counseling, against instructing, against supporting, but promotion in general is incredibly vague and could be used to capture legitimate discussion of activities that individuals one side may deem a terrorist activity, others may dispute that. And it's important to look at the wording of the laws of the proposed amendment as well, because it's not about listed terrorist entities, it's about any terrorist group or activities carried out by terrorist group. So we know that that terrorist group could be what's defined as in Canada, but also that Canada takes from other countries what they view as terrorist groups. So groups that India have deemed to be terrorist organizations, but that in Canada we wouldn't view that as the same. In the United States right now, as was mentioned, the deeming of Antifa or trans rights activists as being akin to terrorism and protest could work its way into what's defined as a terrorist group. And then an activity of a terrorist group, not even a terrorist activity, but as we've seen, for example, the dispute around listing of government-associated organizations. So if a terrorist group is part of a government and there's a health clinic or a ministry that's not involved in terrorist activities, but that you speak out and say that perhaps, and give the example of Gaza and the criticism that of the health ministry in Gaza as being run by Hamas. Because there's a belief that it's a Hamas institution, anyone here who would promote saying that, well, the work of a hospital in Hamas, which in Gaza, which politicians in Canada have said are associated with Hamas, could be viewed as promoting the activity of a terrorist group. It's incredibly broad and could lead to significant criminalization of discussion of current affairs, of legitimate political discussions and debates. And we think that it has no place in Canadian legislation overall, and certainly no place in being brought in as part of an ostensibly combating hate legislation.
Thank you. And next we'll go to Anya.
I wanted to see if any of you have heard of any cases where the religious exemption was actually used. Because we heard a lot about this case of Mr. Cherkaoui in Montreal and the comments that he made, but I'm just looking at here, and my understanding is that the Crown at the time said that they declined to lay hate charges because he didn't target an identifiable group, so the religious exemption was not a part of that. So yeah, my question is, I haven't been able to find, but are any of you aware of any cases where the religious exemption was actually used in Canada?
So as I mentioned earlier, so this is a surprise to all of us, this intent to add this to a bill that continuously expands. So the bill initially was proposed to suggest additional protection to places of worship. And then we see the proposal of the bill starts to expand to beyond places of worship. And even as the chair of the committee was asked if it will include online, it also added to include online expression as well. So the bill is ever expanding in ways that is unprecedented. And now, as it moves towards the close-by-close conversation and the discussions between the different parties, we're seeing all these proposals to continuously expand the bill. So whether to include terrorism definitions, which are definitely out of scope of that initial bill, now the discussion around removing the religious text exemption started. It was not yet formally introduced into the close-by-close conversation. I think it basically adds the challenge of what precedents exist. The challenge is actually how can this be used in the future. So we as a faith community see that this removal of exemption without really fully understanding our religion and our religious text and our religious conversations within our spaces is actually going to be extremely limiting to religious schools, limiting to religious spaces, limiting to promotion of religious text within the public space and within an online space. So the ways the removal of that exemption can be used is actually going to be over-politicized, overcharging of religious institutions, and serious chilling effect within our community. So it's what can it do, is not what the exemptions can be, is the right question.
Right. So, but what I'm hearing is that none of you can point to any case where the religious exemption was actually used successfully. No. Okay, I just want that on the record. And then secondly, we've heard a lot about your concerns. There's a lot of concerns that all of you have put forward. Assuming the government isn't going to withdraw the bill, what would be your top priority amendment or change to the bill that you would like to see?
I mean, I can talk about specifically the protests outside of places of worship, like I talked about last year we saw a community center up in Ottawa hosting an organization that promoted and recruited volunteers to serve in the Israeli military. And there was a big protest that happened outside the community center. And what we saw, Independent Jewish Voices met with city officials a couple of weeks ago. And one of the examples that the city brought up in its need to implement this vulnerable social infrastructure bill in Ottawa, or what we call a bubble bylaw, is that protest. Now, when we talked about it with them, we tried to explain to them that the protest that happened outside of the Jewish Community Center didn't happen because it was a Jewish Community Center. It happened because the Jewish Community Center rented out its space to an outside organization that then behaved in a manner the protesters saw as a need for protest. I also talked about how during the Freedom Convoy occupation, Bikers Church up in Ottawa hosted far-right and fascist protesters that contributed to the anti-Semitic, misogynist Freedom Convoy occupation that we saw up here. And again, under this bill, a protest outside of that church illegal because it's a religious institution. The one thing that we want to make sure that is being heard is the fact that, I mean, I'll use the term that Ottawa uses, vulnerable social infrastructure, cease to be vulnerable social infrastructure when they're used in a manner that's not the intended use of that facility. When a church uses its facilities to rent it out to another group, instead of using it for example, a service, or when a mosque or a synagogue uses it for not its intended use, then it should not be protected under hate crime legislation. For me, I think that that's the biggest thing that we want to get rid of this bill. If other folks have other important considerations.
I think it's really hard to disambiguate the different parts of the bill because so much of it is about the impact on, as Nir was just pointing out, around the impacts on freedom of expression and on assembly. The one part that we haven't really spoken about today are the standalone hate crime offenses. I think if we look at the legislation, that's the part that's most targeted towards addressing hate crimes. There's debate around their effectiveness and the necessity. But I think that what the government needs to be looking at this legislation is really addressing the concerns that have been laid out that will be significantly impacting freedom of expression and freedom of association, and actually harming, as we've heard today, groups that are ostensibly meant to be protected. For us, our priority is that around the terrorist symbols, around the symbols, that this linking to the terrorist entities list is a mistake, that the terrorist entities list itself is discretionary, and that it is also, I didn't mention, but it's also very exclusionary in some ways. So for example, there's no terrorist entity listed that uses a noose or a burning cross as one of their symbols. And so under this legislation, those kinds of symbols would not actually fall under these offenses. And so it points to the difficulty and almost self-defeating nature of trying to say, well, we're going to list certain symbols and not symbols, rather than actually addressing acts of hate themselves and what constitutes an act of hate. And so I think that's, it's broad, but I think that is what the government needs to be thinking about when they're looking at amending this legislation and fixing it so it can go through.
Thank you. And we'll now go to Paula Tran. Do you have a question? No? Are there other questions in the room? No more questions in the room. Did you have something you wanted to add to the last response?
I just wanted to add, just in other words, I'm really struggling to find anything to keep in this bill. So specifically on the Attorney General, removal of the Attorney General consent just expands police powers and police assessment of situations that actually makes, and police and law enforcement in general, makes it basically unchecked until it gets to the court. So really, the bill in all its pieces, and unfortunately even the introduced or the suggested amendments, makes this really an attack on our chartered protected rights, and we see it entirely unconstitutional.
Thank you very much, and that concludes today's press conference.